The gentle clinking of fine china and the soft murmur of conversation filled the air at La Belle Cuisine, a high-end French restaurant nestled in the heart of the city. The establishment's reputation for exquisite cuisine and an air of exclusivity had made it a favorite among the city's elite. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the restaurant's large windows, the dinner service was in full swing. At the center of this culinary haven stood Charles Mendes, the owner and self-proclaimed guardian of the restaurant's prestigious reputation. A man in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and a meticulously trimmed mustache, Charles cut an imposing figure as he surveyed his domain from his usual spot by the bar. His sharp eyes missed nothing, from the crisp white tablecloths to the impeccably dressed waitstaff gliding between tables. Charles prided himself on maintaining an air of exclusivity that bordered on the discriminatory. While never explicitly stated, it was an open secret that La Belle Cuisine was selective about its clientele, particularly when it came to people of color. This unspoken policy had rarely been challenged, as most of the city's wealthy elite either turned a blind eye or silently condoned such practices. As the evening progressed, a new face appeared at the restaurant's entrance. Jamal Carter, a successful real estate mogul known for his shrewd business acumen and philanthropic endeavors, stepped into La Belle Cuisine for the first time. Despite his considerable wealth and influence, Jamal had always maintained a low profile, preferring to let his work speak for itself rather than seeking the limelight. Jamal's presence was immediately noticeable. Dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that accentuated his athletic build, he exuded an air of quiet confidence and sophistication. His dark skin and closely cropped hair stood out in the sea of predominantly white faces that filled the restaurant. As he approached the hostess stand, a ripple of curious glances followed him. The young hostess, a petite blonde named Sarah, felt a flutter of nervousness as she saw Jamal approach. She had been working at La Belle Cuisine for only a few months, but she was already well aware of the unspoken rules that governed the establishment. Glancing nervously at Charles, who had taken notice of the new arrival, Sarah plastered on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice slightly strained. "Do you have a reservation?" Jamal, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension, smiled warmly. His voice was rich and melodious as he replied, "No, I'm afraid I don't. I'm just passing through the city and heard wonderful things about this place. I was hoping to get a table for one, if possible." Sarah's smile faltered for a moment as she glanced once more at Charles, who was now making his way towards them with a slight scowl on his face. Before she could respond, Charles had inserted himself into the conversation, his presence immediately dominating the interaction. "I'm afraid we're fully booked tonight," Charles said curtly, not even bothering to greet Jamal properly. His tone was dismissive, bordering on rude, as he looked Jamal up and down with barely concealed disdain. Jamal, taken aback by the abrupt interruption, raised an eyebrow as he glanced around the restaurant. His keen eye, honed by years in the real estate business, quickly took in the layout of the dining room. He could clearly see several empty tables, their pristine white tablecloths a stark contrast to Charles's claim of being fully booked. Maintaining his composure, Jamal decided to press the issue gently. "It looks like you have a few open seats," he observed, his tone remaining polite despite the growing tension. "I don't mind waiting if necessary. I've heard such wonderful things about your cuisine, and I'd hate to miss the opportunity to experience it firsthand." Charles's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line as he crossed his arms defensively. "Those tables are reserved for important guests," he said, emphasizing the word important in a way that left no doubt about his implication. "We don't take walk-ins. This is a high-class establishment, you understand?" The insult hung in the air, palpable and ugly. A few nearby patrons shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some averting their eyes, while others watched the interaction with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. The soft classical music playing in the background seemed to fade away, replaced by the heavy silence of unspoken prejudice. Jamal stood there for a moment, processing the situation. He had faced discrimination before, but it never failed to catch him off guard. especially in moments like this when he least expected it. The sting of Charles's words was sharp, but Jamal's face remained impassive, years of navigating similar situations having taught him the value of maintaining his dignity in the face of ignorance. "I see," Jamal said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to fill the entire entrance area. "So, there's no chance of getting a table tonight?" Charles, emboldened by what he perceived as Jamal's acquiescence, allowed a smirk to play across his lips. His next words dripped with condescension and barely veiled racism. "Not for you," he said, the weight of his prejudice hanging in the air. "Perhaps you'd feel more comfortable at one of the other places around here. There's a nice soul food restaurant just a few blocks down that might be more suitable for your tastes." The insult was blatant now, stripped of any pretense of politeness. A few gasps could be heard from the nearest tables, and Sarah, the hostess, looked as if she wanted the ground to open up and swallow her whole. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jamal stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable. To those watching, it seemed as if time had stopped, the entire restaurant holding its breath to see how this confrontation would end. But instead of reacting with anger or indignation, Jamal simply nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Charles's face. "I understand," he said quietly, his voice carrying a calm that seemed at odds with the situation. "I'll be back." With those simple words, Jamal turned and walked out of the restaurant, his head held high and his stride purposeful. As the door closed behind him, a collective exhale seemed to pass through the restaurant. Conversation slowly resumed, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort that lingered in the air. Charles, thinking he had successfully rid his establishment of an undesirable guest, shrugged dismissively and returned to his spot at the bar. He wore an expression of smug satisfaction, completely unaware that his actions had set in motion a series of events that would soon shake the very foundations of his carefully cultivated world. As the night wore on, business at La Belle Cuisine continued as usual, but something had changed. The incident, while brief, had left an indelible mark on those who had witnessed it. Some patrons whispered among themselves, expressing discomfort or outright disgust at what they had seen. Others pretended nothing had happened, burying their unease beneath forced smiles and stilted conversation. Little did Charles know that the man he had so callously dismissed was not just another potential customer, but someone with the power to change the very fate of his beloved restaurant. As Jamal Carter walked away from La Belle Cuisine that night, the wheels of justice and redemption had already begun to turn, setting the stage for a confrontation that would challenge long-held prejudices and force a reckoning with the consequences of discrimination. The following morning dawned crisp and clear, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events of the previous night. Jamal Carter sat in his spacious office on the top floor of a sleek skyscraper, his gaze fixed on the cityscape sprawling before him. The early sunlight glinted off the glass and steel of surrounding buildings, creating a dazzling display that usually filled Jamal with a sense of pride and accomplishment. Today, however, his mind was elsewhere. The sting of Charles Mendes's blatant discrimination still lingered, a bitter taste that no amount of morning coffee could wash away. Jamal's fingers drummed a restless rhythm on the polished surface of his desk as he replayed the incident in his mind. He had faced prejudice before, of course. It was an unfortunate reality that even his wealth and success couldn't entirely shield him from. But there was something about the smugness in Charles's eyes, the casual cruelty of his dismissal, that Jamal couldn't shake. As he sat there, surrounded by the trappings of his success, Jamal felt a familiar fire ignite within him. It was the same determination that had driven him to build his real estate empire from the ground up, the unwavering resolve that had seen him through countless challenges and setbacks. He had not clawed his way to the top by backing down in the face of adversity, and he wasn't about to start now. With a decisive nod to himself, Jamal reached for his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment before he dialed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a voice answered, "Good morning, Mr. Carter. How can I help you today?" "Thomas," Jamal said, his voice calm but laced with purpose. "I need you to arrange a meeting with the owner of La Belle Cuisine. It seems we need to have a conversation about his lease." Thomas, Jamal's property manager, was silent for a beat. In the years he had worked for Jamal, he had learned to read the nuances in his boss's tone. The quiet determination he heard now told him that something significant had occurred. "Of course, Mr. Carter," he replied, his curiosity evident. "May I ask what prompted this?" Jamal leaned back in his chair, his free hand absently stroking his chin. "Let's just say I had an enlightening experience there last night. The owner has been mistreating his customers, and it's time we addressed it." Thomas, understanding the gravity of the situation, immediately shifted into action mode. "I'll reach out to him right away, sir. How soon would you like this meeting to take place?" "As soon as possible," Jamal replied. "Preferably tomorrow. And Thomas, don't mention my name or my connection to the property. I want this to be educational." After ending the call, Jamal swiveled his chair to face the window once more. His reflection stared back at him, superimposed over the city he had helped shape. In that moment, he made a silent vow, not just to address this single incident, but to use his position and influence to effect real change. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and creating a city where everyone, regardless of their race or background, could be treated with dignity and respect. As the day progressed, Jamal threw himself into his work with renewed vigor. He attended meetings, made calls, and reviewed contracts, all while a part of his mind remained focused on the upcoming confrontation with Charles Mendez. By late afternoon, his phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. The meeting was set for the following day at 2 p.m. Meanwhile, across town, Charles Mendez was going about his day, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing on his horizon. The events of the previous night had already faded from his mind, dismissed as just another routine enforcement of his establishment's standards. As he prepared for the evening's dinner service, fussing over table arrangements and wine selections, the last thing on his mind was the man he had so callously turned away. When Thomas's call came through, Charles barely gave it a second thought. To him, it was just another routine discussion about rent or building maintenance. Nothing more than a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule. He agreed to the meeting with an air of indifference, his tone bordering on impatient as he penciled it into his calendar. Little did Charles know that this seemingly innocuous meeting would be the catalyst for a profound change in his life and business. The very man he had rudely dismissed the night before was now holding the fate of his beloved restaurant in his hands. As night fell and La Belle Cuisine once again filled with the chatter of wealthy patrons, Charles moved through the restaurant with his usual air of superiority. He greeted favored customers, critiqued the staff's performance with a critical eye, and basked in the atmosphere of exclusivity he had so carefully cultivated.
Not once did he spare a thought for the meeting scheduled for the next day, or for the man. His plush apartment above the restaurant, Jamal spent the evening meticulously planning his approach for the upcoming confrontation. He was not a man given to impulsive action.
He viewed this as an opportunity, a chance to address a systemic issue and potentially change the way business was conducted in his buildings and, by extension, in the city at large. He crafted his strategy carefully, considering various scenarios and potential outcomes. Jamal was well aware of the power he held in this situation, but he was determined to wield it responsibly. His goal was not to destroy Charles or his business, but to open his eyes to the harm caused by his discriminatory practices and to instigate genuine change. As midnight approached, Jamal finally allowed himself to relax. He stood on his balcony, looking out over the city he called home. The lights of La Belle Cuisine were visible in the distance, a glittering reminder of the task that lay ahead. With a deep breath, Jamal reaffirmed his commitment to making a difference, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of prejudice and exclusion. The stage was set, the players were in place, and as the city slept, the hours ticked down to a confrontation that would send ripples through the community. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning, a chance for justice, education, and perhaps redemption. In the quiet of the night, two men in different parts of the city prepared for sleep, unaware of how their paths would collide in the light of day. For Charles, it was just another night before another day of business as usual. For Jamal, it was the eve of a battle he had been preparing for his entire life, a chance to challenge the status quo and pave the way for a more inclusive future. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the city stirred to life, oblivious to the drama about to unfold within its midst. The day of reckoning had arrived, and with it, the potential for transformative change. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the city as Charles Mendez made his way to the address he'd been given for the meeting. His mind was preoccupied with the evening's menu and a shipment of wine that was running late, barely sparing a thought for what he assumed would be a routine discussion about his restaurant's lease. Dressed in his usual polished attire, a crisp white shirt, tailored blazer, and Italian leather shoes that clicked authoritatively on the sidewalk, Charles exuded an air of casual confidence. As he entered the towering office building, Charles couldn't help but feel a twinge of admiration for the sleek, modern architecture. The lobby was a masterpiece of glass and steel, bathed in natural light that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, a far cry from the old-world charm of his own establishment, but impressive nonetheless. He approached the reception desk, announced his name, and was promptly directed to the elevators. The ride to the top floor was swift and smooth, giving Charles little time to ponder the purpose of this meeting. As the doors slid open, he was greeted by a smartly dressed man who introduced himself as Thomas, the property manager. There was something in Thomas's demeanor, a mix of professionalism and barely concealed anticipation, that should have set off warning bells in Charles's mind. But, wrapped up in his own self-importance, Charles failed to notice. Thomas led Charles down a corridor lined with abstract art pieces, their bold colors and shapes a stark contrast to the muted elegance of the rest of the office. As they approached a set of imposing double doors, Thomas paused, his hand on the handle. "Mr. Mendez," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Mr. Carter is ready to see you now." The name meant nothing to Charles as he stepped into the spacious conference room. His eyes were immediately drawn to the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city skyline. It took a moment for his gaze to settle on the man standing at the far end of the room, his back to the door as he looked out over the urban landscape. As the man turned, Charles felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Recognition hit him like a physical blow, and he found himself face to face with the very man he had so callously dismissed from his restaurant the night before. Jamal Carter stood before him, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than Charles's monthly revenue. His expression, a mask of calm authority. "Mr. Mendez," Jamal said smoothly, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." Charles hesitated for a moment, his mind racing to catch up with this unexpected turn of events. He shook Jamal's hand mechanically, mumbling a greeting as he sank into one of the plush leather chairs surrounding the conference table. "I'm sorry," he stammered, his usual confidence evaporating like morning mist. "Have we met before?" A ghost of a smile played across Jamal's lips as he took his own seat at the head of the table. "We have, actually," he replied, his voice level, but carrying an undercurrent of steel. "Last night, at your restaurant, I was the walk-in you turned away." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Charles felt the blood drain from his face as the full weight of the situation crashed down upon him. He stared at Jamal, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as he struggled to formulate a response. Jamal leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished surface of the table. "I'm not just a patron, Mr. Mendez," he continued, his gaze never wavering. "I'm the owner of the building where your restaurant operates. And what happened last night? Well, that was unacceptable." Charles's heart raced, and he felt a wave of panic wash over him. The realization that he had not only insulted a potential customer but also his landlord, a man who held the fate of his business in his hands, was overwhelming. I had no idea, Mr. Carter," he stuttered, his earlier arrogance replaced by naked fear. "I didn't mean to," Jamal held up a hand, silencing Charles mid-sentence. "It's not about who I am," he said calmly, but with an intensity that made Charles shrink back in his seat. "Wah, it's about how you treat people. You made assumptions based on my appearance, and you treated me, and likely others, with disrespect because of it." Charles swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. The carefully constructed facade of superiority he had maintained for so long was crumbling before his eyes. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was a misunderstanding. I never meant to offend." "Was it, though?" Jamal interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Or is this how you run your business? Do you regularly turn away potential customers based on the color of their skin or their appearance?" The question hung in the air, sharp and accusatory. Charles felt trapped, cornered by his own actions and prejudices. He had always justified his selective policies as maintaining the restaurant's exclusive atmosphere, but faced with Jamal's direct challenge, those justifications rang hollow. I don't know what to say," Charles admitted, his shoulders sagging. For the first time in years, perhaps for the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of shame for his actions. Jamal's expression softened slightly, seeing the genuine distress in Charles's face. "You don't have to say anything right now, Mr. Mendez," he said. "Yo, but I do want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you." Charles nodded mutely, his eyes fixed on Jamal as the other man leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed but his gaze still intense. "I built my real estate empire from the ground up," Jamal began, his voice taking on a reflective tone. "I've faced discrimination, prejudice, and countless closed doors along the way, but I persevered, not just for my own success, but because I believed I could make a difference. I believed that by achieving a position of influence, I could help create a world where people are judged by their character, not the color of their skin." He paused, letting his words sink in. Charles listened, transfixed, as Jamal continued. "What you did last night, what you've likely been doing for years, it's not just morally wrong, it's bad business. You're turning away potential customers, potential relationships, potential opportunities, and for what? To maintain some misguided notion of exclusivity?" Charles flinched at the words, but he couldn't deny their truth. He had never considered the broader implications of his actions, the ripple effects of his prejudice. "I'm not here to destroy your business, Mr. Mendez," Jamal said, his tone softening further. "I'm here to challenge you to be better, to do better, not just for me, or for the people you've turned away in the past, but for yourself and for the future of your restaurant." As Jamal spoke, Charles felt something shift within him. The fear and shame were still there, but alongside them, a spark of something else began to grow, a glimmer of understanding, perhaps even the seeds of change. What do you want me to do?" Charles asked, his voice small but steady. Jamal smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes for the first time since the meeting began. "I want you to open your eyes, Mr. Mendez. I want you to look at your business, at your practices, and ask yourself if they truly align with the values of hospitality and excellence that I'm sure you believe in. And then, I want you to make changes. Real, meaningful changes." As the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the conference room, two men sat across from each other, separated by a table, but connected by a moment of profound realization. For Charles Mendez, it was the beginning of a journey, a challenging, sometimes painful, but ultimately transformative path towards redemption and genuine inclusivity. And for Jamal Carter, it was a reminder of the power of patience, of meeting ignorance with education rather than anger. As he looked at Charles, seeing the mixture of fear, shame, and dawning understanding in the other man's eyes, Jamal felt a sense of cautious hope. Perhaps, he thought, this was how real change began. Not with grand gestures or sweeping reforms, but with one person, one business at a time, opening their eyes to the truth. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. As the city lights began to twinkle to life, the two men rose from their seats, ready to step into a new chapter, one that held the promise of growth, understanding, and a more inclusive future for all. In the days following his meeting with Jamal Carter, Charles Mendez found himself in a state of profound introspection. The carefully constructed world he had built around himself, a world of exclusivity, prejudice, and narrow-minded thinking, had been shaken to its very core. As he walked through the familiar spaces of La Belle Cuisine, everything seemed different, as if he were seeing it all through new eyes. The first changes were small but significant. Charles called a staff meeting, something he had rarely done in the past, preferring to issue orders rather than engage in dialogue. As his employees gathered, a mix of curiosity and apprehension on their faces, Charles took a deep breath and began to speak. "I've made mistakes," he said, his voice uncharacteristically humble. "I've allowed prejudice and discrimination to taint our business, and in doing so, I've not only hurt potential customers, but also compromised the integrity of our establishment. That ends now." The staff exchanged glances, a ripple of surprise running through the group. Sarah, the hostess who had witnessed the incident with Jamal, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She had always felt uncomfortable with the unspoken policies of the restaurant, but had never dared to voice her concerns. Charles continued, outlining a series of changes that would be implemented immediately. "From this moment on, we welcome all guests, regardless of their race, appearance, or background. Our only criteria will be their desire to enjoy our cuisine and their respect for our establishment and fellow patrons." He announced that the restaurant would be closing for a week for staff training and some minor renovations. During this time, he brought in diversity and inclusion experts to conduct workshops for all employees. The sessions were eye-opening for many, including Charles himself, who found himself confronting long-held biases he hadn't even been aware of. The physical changes to the restaurant were subtle, but meaningful. The decor, once dominated by images of European landscapes and aristocratic figures, was updated to include artwork from a diverse range of artists. The wine list, previously focused almost exclusively on French and Italian vintages, was expanded to include excellent selections from regions around the world, including emerging wine industries in countries like South Africa and India. But perhaps the most significant change was in Charles himself. He began to take a more hands-on approach to the day-to-day operations of the restaurant, engaging with staff and customers alike. He made a point of greeting guests personally, regardless of their appearance or status, and took genuine interest in their experiences. As word spread about the changes at La Belle Cuisine, the restaurant began to attract a more diverse clientele. At first, some of the longtime patrons grumbled about the shift, but many were won over by the improved atmosphere and the consistently excellent food and service. One evening, about a month after the renovations, Jamal Carter returned to La Belle Cuisine. This time, as he approached the hostess stand, he was greeted with a warm smile from Sarah. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice genuinely welcoming. "It's wonderful to see you again. Your table is ready." As Jamal was led to his seat, he noticed the changes in the restaurant, the more diverse artwork, the varied mix of patrons, the overall feeling of warmth and inclusivity that seemed to permeate the space. He couldn't help but smile, feeling a sense of pride in the transformation he had helped initiate. Charles, seeing Jamal enter, made his way over to the table. Gone was the arrogance and disdain that had characterized their first encounter. Instead, Charles approached with a mix of respect and genuine contrition. "Mr. Carter," he said, extending his hand, "I can't tell you how much it means to have you here. I hope you'll allow me to personally ensure that your dining experience tonight is exceptional." Jamal shook Charles's hand, noting the sincerity in the other man's eyes. "Aye, thank you, Mr. Mendez," he replied. "I look forward to it." As Charles walked away to oversee the preparation of Jamal's meal, he felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his work for years. He realized that true excellence in hospitality came not from exclusivity, but from creating an environment where all guests felt valued and welcome. Throughout the evening, Jamal observed the interactions between staff and patrons, noting the genuine smiles, The attentive service extended to all guests, regardless of their appearance or background. He saw Charles moving from table to table, engaging in warm conversation with a diverse array of diners. As he savored the exquisite meal, a fusion of classic French techniques with influences from around the world, Jamal reflected on the power of accountability and the capacity for change. He had taken a risk in confronting Charles so directly, but the results had exceeded his wildest expectations. Towards the end of the meal, Charles approached Jamal's table once more. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low and filled with emotion, "I want to thank you, not just for giving me and my restaurant a second chance, but for opening my eyes. I've learned more in the past month than I had in years of running this place." Jamal nodded, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Change isn't easy, Mr. Mendez," he replied, "but it's necessary. And from what I've seen tonight, you're on the right path." As Jamal left the restaurant that night, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond any business deal or real estate acquisition. He had not only challenged discrimination, but had been a catalyst for genuine transformation. It was a reminder that sometimes, the most profound changes come not from tearing things down, but from showing people a better way forward. The story of La Belle Cuisine's transformation began to spread throughout the city's business community. It became a case study in how addressing bias and promoting inclusivity could not only be the right thing to do ethically, but could also lead to business success. Other restaurant owners, some of whom had harbored similar prejudices to Charles, began to reevaluate their own practices. For Charles Mendez, the journey was ongoing. There were still moments of discomfort, still ingrained habits to overcome. But with each passing day, with each diverse group of happy patrons who left his restaurant satisfied, he felt more certain that he was on the right path. And for Jamal Carter, the experience reinforced his belief in the power of using his influence for positive change. He knew that the fight against discrimination was far from over, but the transformation of La Belle Cuisine stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the idea that with courage, accountability, and a willingness to change, even the most entrenched prejudices could be overcome. As the lights of La Belle Cuisine glowed warmly in the night, they seemed to shine a little brighter, illuminating not just a restaurant, but a small yet significant victory in the ongoing struggle for equality and respect in the heart of the city. As the seasons changed and months turned into years, the transformation of La Belle Cuisine became more than just a story of one restaurant's journey towards inclusivity. It became a catalyst for change throughout the city's dining scene and beyond, rippling outward in ways that neither Jamal Carter nor Charles Mendez could have predicted. The restaurant, once known for its exclusivity and subtle discrimination, had become a beacon of diversity and inclusion. Its reputation grew, not just for its exquisite cuisine, but for its welcoming atmosphere that embraced patrons from all walks of life. The waiting list for reservations grew longer, filled with names representing a vibrant cross-section of the city's population. Charles Mendez, once the very picture of prejudice and narrow-mindedness, had undergone a remarkable transformation. He became known as an advocate for diversity in the restaurant industry, often speaking at conferences and mentoring young, aspiring restaurateurs from underrepresented backgrounds. The man who had once turned away patrons based on their appearance now championed the idea that diversity was not just morally right, but a key ingredient in a thriving business. One crisp autumn evening, as golden leaves swirled on the sidewalk outside La Belle Cuisine, Jamal Carter once again found himself standing at the restaurant's entrance. This time, however, he wasn't alone. He was accompanied by a group of young entrepreneurs, bright, ambitious individuals from diverse backgrounds who were part of a mentorship program he had recently launched. As they entered, the warmth of the restaurant enveloped them. The air was filled with the tantalizing aromas of French cuisine infused with global influences, and the gentle hum of conversation in multiple languages created a welcoming atmosphere. Sarah, now the maitre d', greeted them with a bright smile. "Mr. Carter, welcome back, and welcome to all of you," she said, her gaze sweeping over the group of young people. "Your table is ready." As they were led to their seats, Jamal couldn't help but marvel at the changes. The walls, once adorned with only European art, now showcased a diverse array of artwork from around the world. The clientele was a vibrant mix of people from various ethnicities, ages, and backgrounds, all enjoying the restaurant's renowned cuisine and warm hospitality. As they settled into their seats, Charles approached the table, his face lighting up with genuine pleasure at the sight of Jamal and his young protégés. "Mr. Carter," he said warmly, extending his hand. "It's always a pleasure to see you, and welcome to all of you," he added, addressing the group. "I hope you'll allow me to prepare something special for you this evening." Jamal introduced Charles to the group, explaining briefly how their paths had crossed years ago. The young entrepreneurs listened with rapt attention, their eyes darting between the two men, sensing the weight of the history between them. As Charles moved away to oversee the kitchen's preparations, one of the young women in the group, Amara, leaned towards Jamal. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice filled with curiosity, "is this the restaurant you told us about? The one that used to—" She trailed off, unsure how to delicately phrase the question. Jamal nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "Yes, Amara, this is the place. But as you can see, it's come a long way." Throughout the evening, as course after exquisite course was served, Jamal shared the story of La Belle Cuisine's transformation with his mentees. He spoke of the initial confrontation, the difficult conversations that followed, and the gradual but profound changes that had taken place. "The lesson here," Jamal said, his voice low but intense, "is that change is possible, even in the most unlikely places. But it takes courage, both to confront injustice and to admit when you've been wrong." The young entrepreneurs hung on every word, their minds whirring with the implications of the story. They saw in it not just a tale of one restaurant's journey, but a blueprint for how they might affect change in their own spheres of influence. As the meal drew to a close, Charles returned to the table, this time pulling up a chair at Jamal's invitation. The two men, once adversaries, now sat side by side, united in their commitment to fostering a more inclusive business community. Charles addressed the group, his voice tinged with emotion. "What you see here tonight," he said, gesturing around the bustling restaurant, "is the result of a journey that began with a confrontation. Mr. Carter held up a mirror to my prejudices, and though it was painful to see my own reflection, it was the wake-up call I needed." He went on to share how the changes at La Belle Cuisine had not only improved the restaurant's bottom line, but had enriched his life in ways he never could have imagined. "I've learned more from my diverse staff and clientele in the past few years than I did in decades of catering to a narrow-key, exclusive crowd," he admitted. As the evening wound down, Jamal looked around the table at the bright, eager faces of his mentees. He saw in them the future of the business world, a future that was diverse, inclusive, and full of potential. "Remember this night," he told them as they prepared to leave. "Remember that change is possible, that one person can make a difference, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to hold people accountable while also giving them the chance to grow." As they stepped out into the cool night air, the city bustling around them, Jamal felt a sense of hope for the future. The transformation of La Belle Cuisine was more than just a single success story. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, accountability, and the human capacity for change. In the years that followed, the ripple effects of that transformation continued to spread. The young entrepreneurs who had dined with Jamal that night went on to build their own successful businesses, each one committed to the principles of diversity and inclusion they had seen exemplified at La Belle Cuisine. Charles Mendes, once the reluctant student, became a respected advocate for inclusive business practices. He partnered with Jamal to create a mentorship program for aspiring restaurateurs from underrepresented backgrounds, sharing the hard-earned lessons from his own journey. And La Belle Cuisine itself became a landmark in the city, not just for its exquisite food, but as a living example of how a business could thrive by embracing diversity and treating every customer with respect and dignity. As for Jamal Carter, he continued to use his influence to push for change, always remembering the night he had been turned away from a restaurant and how that moment of injustice had led to a transformation that touched countless lives. The story of La Belle Cuisine became more than just a tale of one restaurant's redemption. It became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of deeply ingrained prejudice, change was possible. It stood as a testament to the idea that sometimes the most profound transformations begin with a single moment of courage, the courage to stand up, to admit one's mistakes, and to commit to being better. And so, in the heart of the city, La Belle Cuisine continued to thrive, its lights shining brightly each night, welcoming all who came to its doors, a symbol of what was possible when people chose understanding over ignorance, inclusion over exclusivity, and hope over fear. As the city grew and changed around it, the restaurant remained a constant reminder that every meal shared, every conversation had, and every connection made across the lines that once divided us was a step towards a more inclusive and just world. It was a new beginning, not just for a restaurant, but for a community, learning to see the beauty and strength in its diversity.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.